dear friend of mine, Leonardo Flores, who is a co-founder of the Venezuela Solidarity Network. He previously worked as an organizer with Code Pink and as an analyst with the Venezuelan embassy in the US. Leonardo was born in Venezuela and maintains a very close tie to social movement that have transformed the country over the past 26 years. Leo, you have traveled extensively and worked very closely with movement resisting economic warfare in Venezuela. Can you share how sanctions have shaped everyday life there and what the international community often overlooks when we talk about Venezuela?
Sure. And first, let me just say thank you so much for this opportunity, Hanieh, and to the Teaching Network for talking about sanctions. Because, yeah, I think it's been a minute since we have seen a webinar exclusively focused on the issue of sanctions. And before I go into these details about how kind of the Venezuelan people are resisting and how sanctions are perceived from the outside, let me just give you a little kind of a macro overview of what's going on in Venezuela in terms of sanctions. So the Trump sanctions on Venezuela, which are really also became the Biden sanctions, because this is a bipartisan effort of economic warfare against Venezuela, those led to a 99% drop in oil revenues for a country that is almost entirely dependent on oil revenues for its economy. And estimates vary as to the economic costs of the sanctions, but about 2 months ago at the Venezuela Solidarity Network, we had an economist named Yosmed Arayan, who was a member of the Central Bank of Venezuela. And according to his own estimates, he was saying that the cost of the sanctions, including the opportunity costs, was somewhere around $1.15 trillion, something or equivalent to $340 million per day in losses that Venezuela was suffering because of these sanctions. And so what does it mean when you have a government that was previously spending, or that continues to spend actually, roughly around 80 to 85% of its budget on social investment, suddenly losing access to most of its money? Well, what it means is that there's going to be an economic crisis in the country, a massive decline in health and education and standards of living. And we see this, and we can see what happened to Venezuela through, among other indicators, through the Human Development Index, which is this indicator put out by the United Nations Development Program. And what we see is that Venezuela used to be, and this is a paraphrase of a quote from one of the UNDP officials, that in 2013, he said something like Venezuela's HDP used to be kind of stable for like 20 years. And then in the past 10 years, from 2003 on, it skyrocketed. It was on an elevator because of this investment in social programs. But now we see that Venezuela's HDI has gone back to the 2003 level. So it's almost like a 20-year loss of progress and human development in Venezuela due to these sanctions. Alina Duhan, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures, aka sanctions, on the enjoyment of human rights, she said this about the sanctions on Venezuela. She said, "The economic blockade of Venezuela and the freezing of central bank assets have a devastating effect on the whole population of Venezuela, especially those in extreme poverty, women, children, medical workers, people with disabilities or life-threatening or chronic diseases, and the indigenous population." So it's affecting absolutely everyone in absolutely all aspects of their lives, as you said at the beginning, Hanieh. And in terms of health, I don't want to steal Mark's thunder a little bit, but there is a 2019 study from CEPR that Mark wrote where they found 40,000 excess deaths in Venezuela due to the first year of Trump sanctions alone. So in 1 year, an extra 40,000 people died. And that was 8 years ago, 7 years ago. So in that time frame, we can expect at least 100,000, if not more, people who have died in Venezuela due to these sanctions. And how do people die from sanctions? Well, it's because the health systems get totally decimated, because access to food becomes much more difficult. So, for example, in Venezuela, maternal mortality doubled. Food insecurity rose from 2% in 2013 to 14%, excuse me, 5 years later in 2018. I don't have the latest figures, but I assume they're a bit lower now. And we see this kind of everywhere in every aspect of life in Venezuela. So education, I'll just give you a personal anecdote. I have a cousin who took almost about 8 years to graduate college, not because he was a slacker. He was actually a great student, very attentive in school, but so many people left the university, including professors, that the one class or the classes he needed as a requirement to graduate with a political science degree weren't offered for several years. So he was just basically sitting around doing next to nothing because he couldn't get his degree, because the required classes were no longer offered because people had left the university. And this is an example of universities, but the same thing happened K through 12. All of these teachers suddenly left to other Latin American countries. And that really impacts not just your development at the time, but also your future career prospects. Because, you show someone a resume and they're like, oh, it took you so long to graduate college. What happened? You can't really go into a spiel about how sanctions really screwed up your education and your career prospects, right? But that's what happens. And that led to, massive migration in Venezuela. But it's not as bad as it sounds nowadays, because it seems that Venezuela has hit rock bottom. And so it's not all bad news right now. The economy in Venezuela has been growing for 3 straight years. And actually, it was 15% growth in 2022, above 9% growth in 2024. Venezuela went, and here I want to talk a little bit about how the grassroots have reacted, because the people who were most protected by the sanctions in certain ways, or not protected, but most resilient to the sanctions, were the people who were already really organized. So I'm talking about, in Venezuela, that refers to communal councils, which are basically like neighborhood associations where they govern themselves, and to communes. And the Venezuelan commune system really turned out to be very resilient. And not only that, but because of these grassroots efforts, Venezuela totally managed to turn around a really key aspect of its economy, which was that before the sanctions began, Venezuela was importing something around 80% of its food. And then, of course, the sanctions hit, and the sanctions affected the availability of food severely. But now, because of these changes, Venezuela is close to producing 100% of the food it consumes. So that's almost a total turnaround, and that's due to government policy and due particularly to the work done by grassroots groups to encourage local production of food. On top of that, there's a program in Venezuela called the CLAP, which means the local committees for supply and production. It basically gives boxes of food and other items, whether it's toilet paper or whatever, to families about once a month in Venezuela. And at its height, this program reached 8 million families. And this program really may have prevented a famine in Venezuela, because I'm sure folks remember 2019, 2020, 2021, there was story after story about how Venezuela was a total disaster, how it was chaos, how people were starving. Well, they weren't quite starving. They were hungry, but they weren't starving. And they weren't starving because of these efforts to put food directly into the hands of people who needed it the most. And that really saved the country in many ways. And then another aspect of how Venezuela has been able to fight back against these sanctions has been South-South cooperation. And so I want to bring up the example of Iran, because obviously you're from Iran, Hanieh, and it's another sanctioned country. And in fact, ties with other sanctioned countries have really helped Venezuela, whether it's Iran, Cuba, Russia, China. And in terms of Iran, in 2020, Venezuela was going through this really particular crisis relating to gasoline, because while Venezuela produces oil, at the time they weren't producing some of the chemicals that are used to refine oil into gasoline, some of these additives. And Iran came through. They sent not just the additives, but they sent experts to help fix Venezuela's infrastructure for producing these additives. And at different times, they also sent diesel fuel and gasoline. And that helped Venezuela be able to survive some of the worst effects of the sanctions. When we're talking about a time when there were something like millions of liters, say, of milk would be produced, and then they'd be wasted because they couldn't be able to be taken to consumers in time. And because of this kind of South-South cooperation, and not just, timely shipments of gas and other goods, but helping Venezuela recover its economy and recover its infrastructure, now the country's become much more resilient. And when we look at Venezuela now from the outside, you might think, oh, things are really horrible. Things are slightly better. In fact, migration has slowed significantly in the last 3 years, despite what we may see in the media. And that's all due not just to government policy, to grassroots groups, and also to the South-South cooperation that I mentioned, which has been really key in helping Venezuela overcome some of the worst of the sanctions. I think I'll stop it there so that we can have more time for questions at the end.